So apparently, you can follow every rule and still lose your right to vote. And the reason why should make you furious. I'm going to take you through it all. First, the policy, then what it looks like in real life. Today, we're breaking down the SAVE Act and who it will actually affect. It's your boy Trey, and welcome back to Pragmotiv News. The SAVE Act, if passed, would require you to have documentary proof of citizenship to vote. The documents it would require are a birth certificate, a passport, or naturalization papers. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, right? None of us wants non-US citizens to be able to vote. That would bring up some serious constitutional issues. So that's why nobody's arguing for that. Now let me be clear. I live in a red state. I've had to show ID to vote every single time I have voted since I was 18. So on the surface, you might be asking, where's the problem? Why are Democrats pushing back on this? And why are Republicans pushing so hard to pass it? Because if this was just about requiring IDs to register, well, we already do that. The crazy thing is, the same people who talk about small government and states' rights are now pushing for the federal government to control something the Constitution explicitly puts under state control. Because the reason behind this isn't about IDs at all. It's about control on a national level. And when you start talking about national standards, centralized verification, federal oversight, those changes wouldn't just be adjusting our current system. They would be changing it entirely. And changing it in a way the original founders of America clearly didn't want. And look, I'm not a lawyer, but anyone who can read can see all of the serious constitutional red flags this would cause. So again, this isn't about showing ID when you vote. It's about who gets to set the rules, how hard it is to exercise your right to vote, and who gets disqualified in this process. So now let's talk about married women. If you got married and changed your last name and your documents do not match, let's say your license doesn't match your birth certificate, for instance, then the SAVE Act could really affect you. This means you'll need more paperwork in order to vote, and you'll have to go through more BS just to cast your ballot. Now ask yourself, why on earth would Republicans want to stop women from voting? Now let's zoom out. Think about transportation, cost, time off from work, distance to government offices. In many communities, especially minority communities, these aren't small inconveniences. They're mountain-sized barriers. This is where it stops being political. Let me show you what this looks like in real life, not just hypothetically. Someone in my family, a veteran, in his 80s. He can't drive, he's in a wheelchair. Getting him out of the house is not a simple task. It's not just go to the DMV. It takes special transportation and hundreds of dollars and a lot of physical strain. And here's the part people don't think about. He doesn't have all his documents anymore. Not because he did anything wrong, but because life happened. Because disasters like Hurricane Katrina happened. Because the records get lost over time. Right now, he votes by mail and has been legally registered to vote in this red state for decades. But if the SAVE Act were to become law, that wouldn't be enough anymore, because some iterations of the bill right now would require him to show his ID in person. Now think about that. That completely negates the entire reason for voting by mail. What sense does that make? You're telling me someone who served his country, pays his taxes, and voted his entire life might lose his right to vote just because he can't produce paperwork that the system itself makes damn near impossible to replace? This is just one example of many across this country. And all of this for what exactly? When you look at the data, voter fraud is extremely rare, and I mean extremely rare. According to this article from NPR News, following Trump's false claims, leaders in Republican-run states have been ramping up investigations into alleged voter fraud. Despite increased efforts, the number of potential instances of fraud they are actually finding amounts to a tiny fraction of the number of ballots cast in a state's election. In Ohio, Republican Secretary of State Frank LaRose announced in 2022 his office had found 75 voters who allegedly cast a ballot in the state and in another state in 2020. Almost 6 million ballots were cast in Ohio that year. So let that sink in. 75 voters out of 6 million. The article goes on to say that also, after the 2020 election, the Associated Press contacted local election officials in 6 swing states. In their analysis, they found 475 potential voter fraud cases, which amounts to an extraordinarily small percentage of the more than 25 million ballots that were cast in those 6 states. And here's something else. While I was recording this, ABC 7 News reported that Donald Trump himself voted by mail in a recent election in Florida. So think about that. Because the same method of voting that's being questioned for veterans is clearly still being used by the president. So at some point you have to ask, why does Donald Trump think he gets to have a different set of rules for himself? Because if one set of rules applies to everyday people, but something different applies to him and his friends, that just seems very anti-American to me. Especially when we are contrasting it with people who literally fought for our freedom that allows us the right to vote in the first place. So now this is where the entire argument flips. You're willing to disenfranchise veterans who literally fought for your freedom, and women who apparently have to sacrifice their right to vote just because they got married because of non-existent fraud. So what's the real reason then? Estimates suggest that millions of Americans could struggle to meet these new requirements, not because they aren't citizens, but because they are being targeted, because they lack certain documents, access, resources, or status. And people like my family member I just described, those aren't the exception. They're exactly who this legislation targets. No matter what the spin they try to put on it, the devil is always in the details. So now, let's compare how things work right now. California has online registration, identity verified through databases, and citizenship attestation under penalty of perjury. Texas, on the other hand, has a more restrictive process, namely requiring photo identification when casting your ballot. However, they still rely on existing records and does not require documentary proof like what the SAVE Act is proposing. Now, no system is perfect, but as we have established, voter fraud is extremely low. So in my opinion, a better use of federal dollars would be to educate voters on the requirements of their state's voter laws. Send money to states to open satellite government agency offices to make it easier for citizens to get vital records rather than stripping American citizens of their rights. But that's the point. In my opinion, the point is to strip you of your rights. So this doesn't exist in isolation. It all comes back to Project 2025. You know, the big policy playbook created by the Heritage Foundation. That's basically the how-to manual for Trump's second term. There is a section in there that talks about exactly what we're seeing. In fact, there is this cool website that you can go to. Now, I do have to put a disclaimer in there. We here at Pragmotiv are not affiliated with this website in any way. But if you go to the website, it's at project2025.observer. And we'll put it at the bottom of the screen here for y'all. You can see that as I'm recording this video on this website, the Trump regime is 52% complete with Project 2025. He's 52% complete with 1,032 days left until the end of his second term. So if they were able to accomplish 52% of what is in Project 2025 in a year and 3 months, that ought to tell you something. I thought he didn't know what Project 2025 was. They can only do this by controlling the narrative and deciding what you should and shouldn't be outraged by. And that is what I break down this week over on Pragmotiv Plus. You can head over there and subscribe for free to read my article about how just a few families control the news, shows, and algorithms that run our daily lives. Because this isn't policy, this is strategy. So what is the political motivation behind Trump and the Republicans' push for this? Well, laws like this reshape turnout. Turnout reshapes outcomes. The outcomes of elections determine who controls Congress, and 2 years from now will determine who controls the White House. They want you to believe that what they do in Washington is so far removed from what you do on a daily basis in your personal life. But I think the situation with this war in Iran and how fast gas prices skyrocketed overnight should once again show everybody that your vote matters. What the President of the United States decides to do on a given day and what he decided to do last week set off a chain of events that for some this week determined how much food was on their table or whether or not they could afford to drive to visit a family member over the weekend. So don't just ask yourself, does voter ID sound reasonable? Ask yourself, what's really going on? What happens when this hits real people? And ask yourself, what happens if it affects me? You see, the people most affected by laws like this aren't the ones writing them. It's the people who elected them, who aren't watching closely. And once this starts, it doesn't stop. It builds. It expands. Until one day, you wake up and realize everything changed without you.